Hi, Lois Zamora again here. It's wonderful to see you all again. We've been in touch, of course, quite a lot with our quizzes and our discussion postings and so forth. Today I'm with Annie Swank again, and she's going to give the second and final installment of her discussion of Brazil. We'll have a transition. Annie will remind us of where we left off in week 5, and now in week 9 where we're headed to modern Brazil. She's going to begin, and she's kindly posted lecture notes for you, and please do print those out and follow along as you watch this lecture. I think I just talked with Annie about what she's going to do, and I have my notes printed out, and I'm going to be taking notes in the margin. So I think if you do that, you'll keep track of what is a great deal of material about modern Brazil. We're going to be looking first at the Williamson chapter that's assigned, and then at Rebellion in the Backlands, and finally Annie's going to talk a little bit about the movie Bye Bye Brazil that is also assigned. So those are 3 required assignments. Quite a bit of reading and viewing, but I think you'll find that you have a real grasp of Brazil once you've combined Annie's first lecture and this one. You'll remember from week 5 that Annie is a former student of mine. She was in an online class of mine about 5 years ago, and she submitted the wonderful personal paper that you read in week 5 about her growing up in Brazil. So when it came time to organize this class, it occurred to me to ask Annie, as you may remember, I told you last time, it occurred to me to ask her to fill us in on Brazil. She has a very personal perspective, of course, on Brazil, and though she is an accountant and information manager for Hess Oil, very far from academic things, she nonetheless has been willing to prepare these lectures for us and prepare our notes for us. So she's doing us a huge favor, and I'm very grateful to her. With that, Annie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction.
Yes, you're welcome.
Well, as you remember, on week 5, we left Brazil in the 17th century with the golden age of the sugar plantation in the northeast. Brazil is still a colony from Portugal, and things are going fine because the movements to become independent have not reached South America yet. Well, now we're picking up 200 years later. But I would like to give you just a little transition between what we are doing right now and where we left. Well, shortly after Napoleon becomes emperor, he starts invading several countries in Europe, and he invades the Iberian Peninsula in his conquest of Europe. Of course, the British monarchy was enemy of Napoleon, but they supported the Spanish and the Portuguese thrones. So the Portuguese court with Don John V, which was King of Portugal, is moved with all his court to Brazil with the help of the British. And so now Brazil is in effect the site of Portuguese monarchy. And the court is in Rio with the building of castles in the outskirts, in Petrópolis, which means the city of Peter, Teresópolis, the city of Teresa, which were playgrounds for the court around Rio to enjoy the beautiful scenery in their new possession in the tropics. So the Dom Juan, at the same time, there is a certain ferment for independence, as you have, if you have read the other chapters in the Williamson book that cover Spanish colonial America. We have Bolivar, we have Argentina, we have all those, New Peru, it was called, all those colonies of Spain fighting for independence and obtaining their independence through various wars. Well, Brazil is not any different, and Pedro I, which was the son of Don Juan V, he declares independence from Portugal in 1822. Even though he is the emperor himself. So he becomes emperor of Brazil, and he established a constitutional monarchy. At the same time, Brazil goes through economic development, and the South especially the state of São Paulo, becomes very strong producer of coffee, and this economy replaces little by little the sugar plantations of the Northeast, which are in economic decline. We still have the slavery in Brazil, but with the influence of the Republican ideals and the rest of the freedom and all the ferment that is happening in the middle of 19th century throughout Europe, slavery is abolished in Brazil in May 1888, completely bloodless. No war, no fights, just it disappears. Even though a lot of the elite the elite coffee planters in São Paulo, of course, are not very happy because they don't know where their labor supply is going to come from. But the Brazilian elite at the same time was very much influenced by the French, and all the ideas of the French Revolution and the Commune, the 1848 revolution in Europe affect the thinking of the intellectual elites in Brazil. So we have this the idea of republicanism, the res publica, the government of the people, that become an intellectual force among the younger political generation in Brazil. And so in November 1888, we have a bloodless coup from the military, which was very elitist in Brazil at that time, to create a republican new structure in Brazil. So we no longer, within a period of 80 years, we go from being a colony of Portugal to an independent constitutional monarchy, and slavery is abolished, and then we are a republic. So those are incredible changes on the political and the social scene. And as you can imagine, it brings a lot of conflict in Brazil, which is a relatively very stratified society with still tremendous differences in social equality between the rural dispossessed, the new slaves that have left the plantations that are migrated into the city, and a small elite of coffee plantation owners in the south, in São Paulo state. And of course the military, let's not forget the military. They are one of the pillars of Brazil. They want to be represented in government. They want to make sure their desire to maintain order and stability in the country is considered in this new political system. So this is where we get to the First Republic, which is really the beginning of our new chapter about Brazil in 1889. So Brazil becomes a federal republic with 20 self-governing states, with a national government that is headed by a directly elected president, and also we have a Senate and a Chamber of Deputies. So we have representatives from all the states that are going to be coming to Rio de Janeiro, which is the capital, and we have this new government who is trying to modernize the country. The Northeast states, which were the center of the wealth in the 16th and 17th century, are no longer as important. Nowadays, São Paulo state accounts for 40% of the gross national product, mostly to the coffee exports. And there is an alternance of power between São Paulo, which is a very wealthy state, and Minas Gerais, where the mines, as I mentioned before, Minas is mines, Gerais is generals. You know, those were the general mines where the Portuguese had found silver and gold and precious stones. It's a agricultural state also, with a lot of large cattle ranches and latifundios and oligarchies in rural areas. So Minas Gerais is the cattle growers, São Paulo the coffee growers. this is the new pole of power and influence in Brazil, and it's nicknamed Café com Leite, you know, coffee in São Paulo, and the cattle, the milk, the dairy in Minas. So we have coffee with milk running the country now. So at the same time that we have this this tremendous transformation in the country in a relatively compressed period, the mass of the rural poor continues to be very much isolated and ignored. The monarchy didn't really do anything for the rural poor. The republic is not doing anything either, but there's change in the air. And there's going to be several revolts at that time because of this change that is brought, this rapid change, modernization, new institutions. And the poor, they're not educated, they don't really understand what's happening, but they can certainly revolt. And we're going to study one of those revolts called the Canudos Rebellion when we look at the rebellion in the Backlands that was written by Euclides da Cunha in 1902. So there's a note that I'd like to mention now that we're looking at this is, oh, I have it written right here. It's in the introduction to the book on page 15 in Roman numerals. It's the whole concept of national unity. You know, in less than 100 years, Brazil went from a monarchy to a republic. But you know, do we have national unity? And Euclides da Cunha certainly does not think so. And he sees this rebellion as basically being the fault, mankind, which of course is the way Brazil has been governed, is really responsible for all this tragedy. And at the bottom of page 14 in Roman numerals, I'm just going to read a paragraph here who's going to explain a little bit what this rebellion is all about. And it starts, as he saw it, Euclides da Cunha, the writer, it was not the Backland fanatics who were at the bottom to blame, but rather their countrymen of a higher stage of civilization who had left them in a centuries-old darkness, failing to prepare them for sharing the higher responsibilities of democracy. Just like as I just mentioned, you know, we go from monarchy to republic, and those people have been left in the dark ages by the elite. If Euclides da Cunha saw the cause, he also saw a remedy, the only remedy. This entire campaign, the campaign of the military against the peasants, would be a crime, a futile and a barbarous one, if we were not to take advantage of the path opened by our artillery by following up our cannon with a constant, stubborn, and persistent campaign of education, with the objective of drawing these rude and backward fellow countrymen of ours into the current of our times and our own national life. So how are we going to build national unity? We have to educate those people. This is what's going to make Brazil have it's going to prepare the people for the higher responsibilities of democracy. And the monarchy didn't achieve that, and neither is the republic. So this was just a brief side on introduction to the rebellion book. And so we are at the end of the 19th century, and we're beginning the 20th century. And of course, Brazil is not living in a vacuum. We have tremendous upheaval in Europe, the end of World War I, the culture influence of the modernism, of a disaffected Germany that lost World War I. So the same waves of culture and political events that are affecting Europe arrive in Brazil. And we have also this beginning of a Brazilian modernistic thinking intellectual impatience with the established order, and a certain discontent about the way things are. So the abolition of slavery in 1888 had created a certain amount of issues with the labor, because a lot of the slaves left the plantation and moved to the cities, and so the solution was to have immigration from Europe. A lot of Italians, Spanish, and Portuguese immigrants leave Europe at that time and go to South America, especially Brazil. And that my grandfather who was from my grandfather on my mother's side, who was from Galicia in Spain, he left Europe in the late 1890s, and he moved to Brazil as a young boy to better his life from an economic point of view, and also because he was attracted by this age of opportunity, dream of opportunity that Brazil had in the minds of European immigrants. So slowly this new republic is trying to establish a new identity, but we still have intervention with the military and the politics and fight within the elites. It's a new way of governing, and there's still a lot of instability. There's some nationalistic movements that are anti-immigration. They want to keep Brazil for the Brazilians. They resent the large number of immigrants that are coming. And again, it's the intellectual ferment of the post-World War I period. At the same time, because of the coffee exports, Brazil had started to go into debt in order to subsidize the growth of the coffee plantations and their increased exports. And this converged in 1929 when we have the Wall Street crash. The world demand and the subsequent world depression that came not only in the United States but also in Europe. So this affects the market for coffee exports, and so Brazil, which that was their only source of foreign reserves, was their coffee exports. Brazil is severely affected economically by this. And in 1930, 1/3 of Brazil's national budget goes to service the foreign debt. And there's high inflation, and there's rebellions. The people are protesting, so the army steps in to start squashing and to reduce the political tension, and they take over. The army take over, again, because they see their role as maintaining social stability and order, and they appoint Getúlio Vargas as president. Getúlio Vargas was from the state of Rio Grande do Sul, which is a border with Argentina and Uruguay in the southern part of Brazil, and he was a cattle owner, a large agriculture oligarch, and also a military, and so he becomes president of Brazil. So we have this new phase now in Brazilian politics that was called the Estado Novo, the new state, and it's the beginning of the government, of the state, intervening in economic direction to create industries that are nationalized, and so the thinking is, the states know better what is good for the country. We're going to invest heavily in steel, electricity, roads, and we're going to develop the country. And we're going to create industries that we can export from, and we're going to prevent imports from coming in. We're going to develop our own grassroots manufacturing base. So the industrialization is guided by the state, and in order to develop this economy successfully, the state does not want social dissent. They don't want intellectual ferment, so it becomes a highly controlled environment, corporatist, where the state knows better what's good for you. And it's not very different from Italy under Mussolini, not very different than Germany under National Socialism. There's a lot of fascism at that time in Brazil. And of course, if a lot of federal patronage also, that is bringing industrialists and large landowners into the political elite. And it's the beginning of the middle class, the beginning of a working class. We have factories that are being established because, of course, we don't have imports, so we have to manufacture our own goods. And in 1934, Vargas suspends the constitution. And it's a completely authoritarian government. There are no political parties. There's press censorship, and civil rights are abridged. And again, this is done with the intent of managing the economy. We don't want dissent. We're going to decide how we're going to run this country. So the state takes a very active role in developing mining, steel, oil, electricity, chemicals, and motor vehicles. It's the beginning of industrialization in Brazil on a very great scale. And there's a new labor code, very much mirrored in Mussolini's labor code from fascism, which encourages social tranquility. We're going to control the unions, we're going to control the workforce, but we're going to give them benefits. We're going to give them a safety net, good salaries, but they cannot complain. They cannot really oppose our economic policy. So Brazil at this time is kind of sitting on the fence. You know, it's the beginning of World War II. They flirt with fascism, but they also know that the United States is entering the war, incredible military machine. So they just don't know where they're going to really give their allegiance. And finally, Brazil supports America in World War II and sends troops to Europe to fight in Italy, of course, in exchange for foreign investment and technical advice from the United States. And so at this time, we're talking in the early 40s, this is when my father, who was French, migrates to Brazil. So Brazil is becoming this new industrial state, still extremely controlled and rigid, but with a lot of promise. And so my father in Europe, seeing all the chaos that is coming with World War II, he takes his chances and he jumps in a boat as an immigrant and moves to Brazil. So now Brazil is aligned with America, but it continues to flirt with a certain amount of leftist nationalism. Not so much because it's leftist, but more because it's nationalism. And nationalism is an incredible strength in politics, as we know, throughout Southeast Asia, South America, Africa. It's at the same time we have colonies in Africa that are ex-colonies that are becoming independent. The whole concept of asserting states' rights. So Brazil brings back in 1946 liberal democracy. The United States didn't really like the leftist tendencies that the Getúlio Vargas government was moving into, and so behind the scenes the United States talks to the Brazilian military and say, oh, Getúlio, he's going a little bit too much on the left. Maybe we should bring another government that is a little bit more center-right and more aligned to our way of looking at liberal capitalism. So the army asks Getúlio to resign, and we have liberal elections, and a new president comes in, which is called Dutra, and that is in 46. We have a new constitution with the continued commitment to industrial development. The basic policy of development and industrialism does not change. It's just the flirtation with the left is under control now. But however, the public sector is increased through nationalizations, and we continue with state planning. the state knows better how to manage the economy. This is the beginning of the opening of the Amazonas frontier in the 50s, because we still have this big, massive rural peasantry that has no land, and so they start encroaching on the forest. Brazil also had very, very lenient laws concerning squatters. If a big landowner, for instance, allow squatters to occupy a piece of his land, and they just stay there, and maybe they till the soil and they start planting for their own survival, within a couple of years they might claim possession. It's Brazil has very, very lenient adverse possession rules. So a lot of parts of the Amazon start to get occupied, and other estates where we have absentee landlords also. However, because we still have the need to import large foreign investment in order to subsidize this economic growth, we have a very high debt economy, with foreign capital financing industrialization. At the same time, we have also high inflation. So Brazil is in this dual situation where the leftist nationalists are against foreign investment because they want to keep Brazil for Brazilians, but they realize that the foreign investment is needed, and the government prints the money in order to be able to pay this huge bill of nationalization. So we have foreign debt increase and high inflation at the same time, which is the beginning of this recipe for disaster that's only culminate in the 1980s here. So we continue to have a conflict here between a sound economy directed by foreign investors and the leftist tendency to increase the minimum wage and reduce the strikes and to give in to labor demands. So the government is trying to do a balancing act between allowing the foreign investors to be happy and at the same time give some happiness to the leftists and to the labor classes. However, at the same time, there was a continuous political what the term I'm trying
conflict.
to say? Conflict and
disagreement or something.
And also scandals, some political scandals, because there's a huge amount of graft and corruption, and so one of Vargas' bodyguards was accused of trying to assassinate a political opponent, and so we have this big scandal, and Vargas is forced to resign, and in disgrace he commits suicide in 1954. And at the same time, this is when I was born. I was born in 1955. This is all the same time. I remember my mother telling me when I was little that Vargas was really loved by the people, the little people, those that were, the wages were being increased, the social benefits were there because of Vargas legislation. So the little people really liked him, and it was a huge sadness when he killed himself. And my mom cried. I remember she telling me that they were all crying when they heard the news. They were very, very touched. But it's a turning page in Brazil. It's the beginning of a massive change again. We have free elections, and Juscelino Kubitschek, which was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, is elected in 1955, and his program is to expand the economy. And a dream that the Brazilians had for a long time, which was to move the capital from the coast to the hinterland for increased protection, and also with the objective to develop the interior of the country, is finally achieved. And in 1956, Juscelino Kubitschek announces that we're going to build a new capital, Brasilia, in the state of Goiás. 600 kilometers from the coast. And this new capital is built in 4 years from nothing. In 1960, the Brasilia is inaugurated as the third capital of Brazil. Of course, the first one was Salvador in the northeast. The second one was Rio on the coast, and Brasilia is the third. So in order to finance this massive city, which is modernistic and image of the future, Brazil incurred even more debt. And a lot of bureaucracy generate endemic corruption. The contracts to build the city were all, padded with politicians getting a lot of bribes. Shouldn't say bribes, but increase in their pocketbook. Let's put it this way. So Brazil at the same continues with the policy of industrialization, development of the interior, but also again flirt with the left. And we are now in 1959, 1960. Fidel Castro is in charge in Cuba. Brazil supports Fidel. Brazil recognizes Fidel Castro. Brazil supports the Soviet Union. Brazil supports China. Those are things that the United States don't appreciate very much. And let's not forget, the United States is giving us massive foreign aid because we have John Kennedy Alliance for the Progress at that time, which was like a Marshall Plan for Latin America. The Marshall Plan, of course, was done for Europe after World War II to help rebuild their economies. So John F. Kennedy has this Alliance for the Progress. So the United States' interest, political and economic, is to have South America, of course, align with liberal capitalism. And they don't, they're giving us a lot of foreign aid. Their economy, at the same time, American companies are financing our expansion and growth. And Brazil is flirting with America's enemies, Cuba, Soviet Union, China. So there's a certain amount of resentment there, and a lot of rumors of military coups. How are we going to continue to rectify the country's finances and bringing industrialization and at the same time flirt with the left? We don't want to. The Brazilian government doesn't want to alienate the nationalistic left. That's why it supports Cuba, but it knows that we need to maintain tight relationships with America in order to improve our economy. So they continue to play that balancing role. At the same time, here it's because of the influence of Castro in Cuba, and we have the ex-colonies in Africa that are becoming independent. We have this flow of nationalism and leftism that is engulfing the third world, and this is happening in Brazil. So the universities are full of socialist ideas. There are illegal land occupation by activists. We have industrial strikes. We have agitation in the factories. Trade unions are in rebellion because we're talking here about the early 60s. The world is changing. The tremendous change in the world, and let's not forget it's the beginning of but one of the heights of the Cold War. Also, the Soviet Union was doing their part to maintain this agitation throughout the world. So Brazil now has an inflation rate of 65% per year, continue dependence on American foreign aid, and at the same time, because of high inflation and all this economic chaos and political discontent, the foreign capital is leaving the country, which exacerbates the confusion. So the new president, which is João Goulart, which comes from the south, and he was also a landowner, a cattle rancher in Rio Grande do Sul, he's trying to come up with an economic plan, which was called the Dantas Furtado plan, so that we can control wages to reduce inflation, bring structural land reforms to give lands to the peasants. But at the same time, this plan doesn't really help anybody. Infuriates everybody. The wage controls infuriate the right and the left, and the beginning of a land reform infuriates the right, of course, and the Americans are not happy with this. So the situation becomes worse and worse until finally, in March 31st, 1964, there is a military coup supported by the United States, which was completely bloodless. João Goulart was deposed. He took exile in Uruguay, and we have a new president that is an army general in Brazil, Humberto Castelo Branco. I was 9 years old in 1964, living in Rio de Janeiro, and I remember very well the soldiers in the streets. They had their rifles, or I can't remember if it was rifles or machine guns, but they had them in 3 tripods at every street corners. You had tanks in the streets. There was curfew. The grocery stores, you had to line up to go buy bread, line up to buy milk. A lot of political uncertainty, but it all happened with no blood. Nobody was killed. It was all the military supported the coup. There was no dissension among them, and it was peaceful in a certain way, if you can call this peaceful. But as a little girl, I can never forget the images of the soldiers in my street, in front of my building. And I did forget to mention that around when Brasilia, Brasilia was created and inaugurated in 1960, and in 1962, my mother's sister, which was my aunt, which came from the Northeast, she left for Brasilia. She, again, believed that she was going to be able to better her life and increase her economic station by moving to this new capital. And so she moved to Brasilia and became a seamstress, and she stayed in Brasilia until the end of her life. So this is just a side note that will tie in with the movie that we're going to discuss later, Bye Bye Brazil. So 64, we have military rule in Brazil, and the military rule is going to last for 20 years, from 1964 until 1984. Long time with, of course, different stages. In the beginning, the general stepped in because, again, their role was to save the country, which is on the verge of insolvency and political chaos. So they continue with state intervention, but with a general opening to the foreign investments. They don't want to. There's no more flirtation with the left. Let's put it this way: the opening to the left is gone. Brazil is completely anti-communist. Sever relations with Cuba. Sever relations with the Soviet Union. Completely aligned with American foreign policy. And I mean, of course, I was a little girl, and I remember rumors that we were told that communists are bad. They eat little children for breakfast. Jokes that were circulated, of course, to make us very, very scary of the communists. So the economy is stagnating, but little by little, with the opening of more American aid, more American foreign investment, there is an economic upturn. The military introduced deflationary measures, and they cut imports and their export incentives to foster the economy. So there's a certain stability that starts to appearing in the economic scene. Foreign companies entered the Brazilian market, but of course the Brazilian market was not prepared for foreign competition because, remember, for the last 30 years Brazil had prohibited imports, and or tax them very, very, very high. So all of a sudden we have those foreign goods that are flooding the market, and the local manufacturer just cannot compete against them, and there's a lot of bankruptcies, layoffs, which causes social unrest, strikes, demonstrations. So we are now in 1968, and we have a lot of manifestation, protests, student revolts. And 1968 is really a watershed year all over the world. In the United States, we have Vietnam War, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated, Martin Luther King is assassinated. We have riots in the black neighborhoods in America. In Europe, we have the student protest, May 68 in France. The country is paralyzed with strikes, protests in Germany and throughout Europe. So the whole world is burning basically, and Brazil is not immune to that. So there is a movement of urban guerrilla in Brazil that starts at this time, and they're very much Marxist, and they want to jump Brazil from what it is to a complete Marxist state. Unfortunately, they are fighting a unwinnable war, because they're an educated elite group of university students backed by maybe a few ex-military people, and they don't have the support of the people. They don't. The peasantry has no idea who Marx is. They don't understand their intellectual speech and discourse. So of course they don't have support among the peasantry. The middle class does not support them. The industrialists, of course, do not support them. So they become a very isolated guerrilla staging urban warfare. And their main sources of what they do, basically, they rob banks. They throw grenades in the bank, create mass confusion. They go in with weapons and they steal money. And that's how they finance the buying of more weapons, and they're all underground operations. And they're mostly active in the big cities, in Rio, in São Paulo, in Minas. They're not successful in the countryside at all. And one of their biggest coup, if one can call this a coup, was the kidnapping of the American ambassador in Rio in 1969. Of course, Brasilia is the capital, but because Brasilia had such small infrastructure and was such a small town, very provincial, the foreign governments did not want to move their embassies from Rio. So all the embassies had stayed in Rio. The foreign diplomatic corps was in Rio, and only really the Brazilian government bureaucrats were in Brasilia. And actually they only really spent the week there, because on the weekends they came to Rio. So this was the beginning. Of course, Brasilia is not like this at all nowadays. I think in the middle 70s, finally the diplomatic corps closed their embassies in Rio. They became consulates, and they moved all the embassies to, well, they built new embassies, very modernistic, of course, in Brasilia. But in 1969, the Brazilian embassy is still in Rio, in a street not far from where I went to high school, and my school bus would go in front of the American embassy. And I remember at the time when the kidnapping occurred, of course, the city, there's massive blockades and military checkpoints everywhere. And eventually, they had the American ambassador in different safe houses, and they released him in exchange for the release of, I think, 40 other terrorists that had been captured by the government, and they were giving a free laissez-passer to go to Algeria. So, 40 Brazilian students go to Algeria. In exchange, the American ambassador is released, and it was a time of a lot of uncertainty, and we had a lot of censorship in Brazil. The government, of course, had completely blocked all the political parties. The television was censored, the press was censored, the radio was censored, the movies were censored. The military had control of everything. There was a newspaper that we used to read called Jornal do Brasil, and in the front page of, well, not on the front page, they would show the articles that had been censored. We had just a white spot. Some papers continue to print as usual, like there was no censorship, and if an article had been censored, it was just replaced by a different subject, another article. But this specific journal, they left the spaces blank where the subject matter had been censored as a gesture to signify we are under military dictatorship. We don't have political rights. We don't have the right to print what we need to say. And of course, the students were protesting, and there were a lot of manifestations and a huge amount of revolt going on at that time. An interesting note is that one of the students that was involved with that urban guerrilla, her name is Dilma Rousseff. She is now running for president of Brazil, and in last Sunday, October the 3rd, she won 46% of the votes to be president of Brazil. And it's interesting that she was a guerrilla herself. She had been arrested by the government, tortured, and then later on had her civil rights restored, and joined, of course, the mainstream political parties and run for president. Unfortunately, she had to obtain 50% at least of the votes to be able to become president on the first turn, and because she did not get 50%, there's going to be a runoff on October 31st. So it would be interesting to see here on October 31st if she is elected president of Brazil, coming from a background as a student militant Marxist. She'll be leading one of the growing economies in the world that is quite unique. So we're moving now into the 70s, and Brazil is reaping the benefits from this openness to foreign investment, and we have an economic miracle in effect. Between 1968 and 1974, Brazilian economy grows an early rate of 10 to 11%, and the volume of exports quadruple in this decade. It's called the miracle decade. In 1970, Brazil wins the World Cup of soccer, which was held in Mexico City, and the military used the World Cup winning for this incredible explosion of nationalism, fervor, and fever. The whole country is covered with flags. There are songs, hymns, marches, parades, sports and politics were used very, very successfully by the government to jump in on the success of the World Cup, to showcase the miracle that Brazil has experienced on the economic front, with growth rates of 10% per year. We have this continuous sustained drive for industrial growth, and still foreign loans, and still managed by the state. Because the constitutional politics had been suspended, the technocrats supported by the states had the free hand to completely modernize the economy without labor unrest, without nationalistic pressures from the left. This is finally they have finally found the recipe here for development. However, the gap between the rich and the poor continues to increase, and the richest 10% of the population receives almost 51% of the national income. And we have around the large cities shanty towns, which we call favelas, which are housing large masses of poor with no sewer, no electricity, with malnutrition, diseases, no education, high crime, high mortality, and it's a disaster from a social perspective. The foreign debt continues to mount, and the inflation rate is exceeding 100% per year. And the currency is devaluated every 4 or 5 years. They cut 2 zeros out of the currency, and they issue new bills. They just print a bunch of new money. That's how we can survive in this economy. Wages are indexed so that every 3 or 4 months you get a big 10% raise. But it's not really a raise. You're just getting adjusted for the inflation rate that is eating up your wages. And this of course is a very unstable economic environment, because you cannot plan in a high inflation environment. You cannot invest. The business doesn't know how to handle a situation as unstable as that. And the currency was depreciated. The capital continues to leave the country. The people that have money, they don't want their money in Brazil. They want their money in Switzerland. So that, of course, decreases the amount of money in Brazil to be reinvested to produce more jobs and create wealth. So this economic miracle has such horrible effects that at the end of the 80s, at the end of the 70s, in 1982, Brazil is in the worst financial mess that it has ever been. It has the highest foreign debt that was ever achieved. I think it was like $89 billion. And they cannot pay. They just cannot make their payments to the banks. Brazil has to renegotiate their foreign debt. And the military realized that they don't have the answer. They've tried. They stepped in several times. They create social policy. They create industrial policy. But they just cannot solve the inflation issues that Brazil has and the foreign debt. So there is a liberalization and a return to democracy, a slowing of the political environment where press censorship is relaxed, political parties are allowed, and no more torture, and free indirect elections. So this is the time when the political exiles return home, because the intelligentsia, of course, had left. In the 60s, writers, artists, playwrights, musicians, they had left for Mexico, they left for Algeria, left for Italy, France, Europe, because they couldn't survive in Brazil. They couldn't produce, they couldn't write, they couldn't create. But in the late 70s, they come home. So there's this huge ferment of openness, abertura in Portuguese. And there's a consensus that finally we tried it, and the military tried, and they couldn't get it. So what is the alternative here? Let's try democracy. So in 1985, we have indirect elections, which brings this fragile consensus for political reforms back together. And between 85 and 89 is the beginning of the return to democracy. It's not direct free elections, it's indirect elections, which it's complicated to explain, but basically you cannot directly elect president. You can elect senators, and then they will meet and appoint the president among a very narrow elite of rulers. But it's the beginning. It's the beginning for democracy. And Brazil address their debt issues by talking to the bankers and renegotiating the foreign debt. And at this time, in 1985, the inflation rate is 230%. and it's going to get worse because by 1990, inflation rate is 2,700%, 2,700% a year. The prices are not even written on the merchandise because as soon as you put a ticket on an item, the price has already gone up. It's unimaginable. They cannot manage this debt and this inflation without social hardship. So at the same time, we have a failure of land reform, and it's a chaos from an economic point of view. So in 1990, it was the first time that Brazil has direct presidential elections since 1961, and a brand new technocrat politician from the Northeast called Fernando Collor, which had no history in national politics at all, is elected. And he brings a complete new set of reforms that are privatizations, massive layoffs of the federal government workforce, spending cuts, liquidity freeze to try to control the inflation, reduce the debt, and open the market to foreign investments. And at the same time, Argentina was doing the same thing with I can't forget about it. Argentina was doing the same thing because they had also the problem with the foreign debt. And Collor had his plan was called the Plano Cruzado and the Plano Real. They froze all the bank accounts. Everybody's bank account was frozen because they didn't want any money in circulation. They wanted to reduce the amount of money so that the inflation would be tackled. And you could only have access, I think, to minimum like maybe $100 a month. Mm-hmm. Of course, you know, in American terms, it sounds insane, but with $100 a month, you had to be able to manage to eat and survive because they did not want currency in circulation. And that's how they changed the inflation rate. They were able to control the inflation rate. So we're leaving Brazil in 1990s. And of course, since then, a lot has occurred. We have now a truly free elected government. We have a new economic miracle. The financial crisis of 2008 did not affect Brazil. Brazil is in very, very sound financial situation now, and I'm sure you've heard of the BRIC, right? Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which are the 4 countries that are going to lead us into the new economic order. So this is the complete of chapter 11 in the Williamson book, and we're going to shift our attention now to the rebellion in the backlands, which is called in Portuguese Os Sertões. Sertão is the name of the geographical area and also agricultural type of fauna that is grown in this part of Brazil. So this is a book that is considered to be one of Brazilians' greatest books because it mixes science and literature, and it addresses what it is to be a Brazilian, a fundamental question of social conscience and social unity of Brazilian being. The settlement of Canudos at the end of the 19th century was situated in the northeast, in a very backwards, inland, poor area, and somehow this messianic leader called Antonio Conselheiro, which was really a fanatic, psychopath, he just was able, with his supporters, to maintain the Republican Army at bay for several months. So he won a lot of little battles, but he finally lost the war because of the sheer force of the army that was sent against him and, of course, the weaponry. But it's the fight of the backland inhabitant against the modern Brazilian coastland. The 2 worlds, the coast, modernist Brazil, and the interior. So there are some things that, of course, the book has been criticized for, especially the social Darwinism and racial composition of a new man that is going to bring progress in civilization. But those ethnocentric exaggerations are really they say that Da Cunha was the victim of his times. Those were theories that were extremely popular at the end of the 19th century, and he, as other intellectuals of that time, believed in them. And I don't think we can really say that he was a racist per se. I think he was more influenced by positivism and social Darwinism. And there's an interesting paragraph, I think, that will explain this in the introduction on page 16. Gilberto Freire, which is a Brazilian sociologist, said that Da Cunha was really a victim of scientific preconceptions with the appearance of anthropologic truths, which were common at the turn of the century, and that he really did not carry his racial theories to any mystical extreme. So, as I mentioned in our first lecture, Brazil is really a mix of races. It's very, very hard to say, are you white, are you black, are you Indian? There's so much intermix and miscegenization that we don't look at people that way. So, Da Cunha comes to this conclusion that there's no such thing as a Brazilian race, a Brazilian type, But, however, he discovered there is a strong race in Brazil. And this is the mestiço cowboy of the backlands, which is the sertanejo in the Canudos. And Da Cunha states that this type, this cowboy of the backlands, is the very core of our nationality, the bedrock of our race. So this is the protagonist of the book, the hero of the book, is this cowboy of the interior. And the book is divided into 3 parts. The first part is called A Terra, which is the land, and portrays the northeastern backland and the war scenario. The second part is O Homem, the man, which describes the inhabitants and their race composition, as well as what they do, how they live, how they feel, and there's a lot of opposition between the interior backland person and the elite, educated coastland Brazilian. And finally, the third part of the book is A Luta, the war. And this is going to narrate the conflict between the Republican army that came to destroy the Canudos village and the sertanejos, who, despite being considered racially degenerated, they succeed in winning many battles, even though they're going to lose the war. So I have chosen some parties in the book, some excerpts.
We have another about 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. I have chosen some excerpts. If you look at the outline, I separated in both the land and the man parts that I thought were very interesting, very well written, where he describes the cartography of the regions, the flora, the fauna, the aridity, the dryness, the suffering that the climate brings on the man. And then in the man, I also highlighted some parts where he talks about how complex the ethnological problem is in Brazil, the mix of the Portuguese, the Jesuits, the African slaves. Those are things that we discussed last time. And finally, how he describes the sertanejo. I think the most there's a couple of things. I don't know if we're going to have time to cover everything.
I'd love to hear you read a couple or three of the passages.
Okay.
I think that would be wonderful.
I think on page 9. Well, no. Hold on. Let's look page 11. On page 11, he describes the arid land, the Caatinga, which is this piece of land that is so dry in the northeast where those people live. And he's talking about how you venture in that land. In the second paragraph below, en route to Monte Santo, and he goes, after this, however, there are places which become increasingly arid. Having crossed the narrow strip of savannas beyond the last named river, one is, to employ the expressive phrase of the backwoodsman, in the wilds. Here are shrubs with scarcely any roots in the scant earth and with intertwining branches, with solitary cacti here and there, standing stiff and silent, giving to the region the appearance of the edge of a desert. The physiognomy of the inhospitable hinterland now begins to emerge, slowly and impressively. And this is the Caatinga.
Excuse me, I can't help interrupting. I have this part heavily underlined myself. I love this idea of the physiognomy of the land. Physiognomy is facial structures. I can speak of someone's physiognomy, but I don't usually think of the land as a self. So this idea of the land beginning to be personified, I think we're going to see later. There are the dead lakes, of course we speak of the Dead Sea and so forth, but this writer feels this land so personally that it becomes a living thing, even as he's describing the desert. Anyway, I was delighted that I've heavily underlined the same passage that you wanted to point out. Keep going, sorry.
On page 22, there is a description of the climate. Of course, Da Cunha, if you read the introduction and you read a little bit about him, he was a military man, but he had training as a geographist and a scientist also. He was an
geologist,
and engineer. So in the middle paragraph on page 22, he gives you a very precise description of the climate, of the humidity and the temperatures, and then right in the middle it starts the barren earth holding counterpoise the emissive and absorbent capacities of the materials that go to compose it, at once stores up the heat of the sun's rays and then, on a sudden, drains it off. It is a sun-baked and turns freezing cold in 24 hours' time. The sun beats down upon it and it absorbs the rays and multiplies them, reflecting and refracting them in a dazzling glow of light. Over the tops of the hills, down the furrowed slopes, the chips of broken silica appear to take fire and gleam vibrantly like sparks. The quivering atmosphere near the ground is like that of the mouth of a furnace, its effervescence rendered visible in the expansion of heated air columns. The day, incomparably bright with the glow, blasts the silent landscape, and the leafless branches of a flora that has succumbed to the heat sink back into the bosom of a stricken nature, in the immobility and peace of a long, protracted spasm.
Wow.
I can feel it.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And a fabulous translation.
Yes.
The English is divine.
Yes.
So if we can't read Portuguese, as I cannot, we have to appreciate
I mean,
that.
it's just incredible how he describes this. There's one more passage here on page 30 about the Caatinga. And the Caatinga is just a Brazilian. At the bottom of the page, you see, for a definition and description of the Caatinga.
Page, sorry?
Page 30.
Thanks.
You know, Caatinga is just a Portuguese name of the specific type of vegetation and landscape. Mm-hmm. And it's the second paragraph, say, here. And he's talking about the traveler that is traveling in the backlands. The Caatinga, on the other hand, stifles him. It cuts short his view, strikes him in the face, so to speak, and stuns him, enmeshes him in its spiny woof, and holds out no compensating attractions. It repulses him with its thorns and prickly leaves, its twigs sharp as lances, and it stretches out in front of him for mile on mile, unchanging in its desolate aspect of leafless trees, of dried and twisted boughs, a turbulent maze of vegetation standing rigidly in space or spreading out sinuously along the ground, representing, as it would seem, the agonized struggles of a tortured, writhing flora. It's
tortured, writhing flora. Wow.
So there's some more passage that I'm sure that, it's hard to pinpoint just a few because so many of them are interesting. But let's move to the man, if that's okay. I think on page 82. I think the description of the sertanejo is probably the most interesting on page 89. So he's talking about this degenerate race that has been abandoned by everybody for 300 years in the interior of Brazil. And he's the sertanejo. He's the man of the backlands. On page 89, he's above else a strong individual. He does not exhibit the debilitating rachitic tendencies of the neurasthenic mestizos of the seaboard.
Wow, yeah.
His appearance, is it true, at first glance, would lead one to think that this was not the case. He does not have the flawless features, the graceful bearing, the correct build of the athlete. He is ugly, awkward, stooped. Hercules Quasimodo reflects in his bearing the typical unprepossessing attributes of the weak. His unsteady, slightly swaying, sinuous gait conveys the impression of loose jointedness. His normally downtrodden mien is aggravated by a dour look which gives him an air of depressing humility. On foot, when not walking, he is invariably to be found leaning against the first door post or wall that he encounters, while on horseback, if he reins in his mount to exchange a couple of words with an acquaintance, he braces himself on one stirrup and rests his waist against the saddle. When walking, even at a rapid pace, he does not go forward steadily in a straight line, but reels swiftly, as if he were following the geometric outlines of the meandering backland trails.
Very interesting.
And then on page 90,
I was just gonna interrupt one moment to say that kind of description is offensive in some ways to us U.S. people in 2010, because to type someone in a negative way like that. But that's what I think that's important to understand, that as you pointed out earlier, Annie, that's part of the way that people thought about racial types at the turn of the 20th century, not so long ago, that certain people had certain strengths, other groups of people were by definition, let's say, inferior. And whether we call it racism, it is not quite racism, it's a certain theory of how human beings are, called social Darwinism. So that's something to take in mind.
And also, let's not forget colonialism, because Rudyard Kipling, which was the epitome of the British Empire,
right?
He wrote the White Man's Burden,
right? Exactly.
The white man,
Rudyard Kipling.
Yeah.
If you know his what are the Jungle Tales.
Yes.
Some kids read them
in India. The White Man's Burden was basically to educate the colonial inferior others. That's why that was the purpose of the empire.
That's right,
the British Empire,
and the justification
for it was a prevalent way of thinking at the 19th century.
There we go.
Which disappeared, of course, with the end of colonialism.
That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm.
So I just want to mention in page 90, he describes this man who is always tired, the sertanejo, can completely change in just a minute when he has to do things with his horses,
Mm-hmm.
At the bottom of page 90, on the last paragraph, right in the middle, he says, glued to his horse back, with his knees dug into its flanks until horse and rider appear to be one, he gives the bizarre impression of a crude sort of centaur, emerging unexpectedly into a clearing, plunging into the tall weeds, leaping ditches and swamps, taking the small hills in his stride, crashing swiftly through the prickly briar patches, and galloping at full speed over the expanse of tablelands. Okay, so I think the last thing that I'd just like to mention is on page 149, he describes this new population that is going to be really the hero of the book. Those are all those dispossessed that have gathered around Antonio Conselheiro, the mythic prophet, who is promising them relief from their existence. And on the top of page 149, the first paragraph, he says, the population of Canudos was made up of the most disparate elements, from the fervent believer who had voluntarily given up all the conveniences of life elsewhere, to the solitary bandit who arrived with his blunderbuss on his shoulder in search of a new field for his exploits. But under the spell of the place, all these elements were welded into one uniform and homogeneous community, an unconscious brute mass, which, without organs and without specialized functions, continued to grow rather than evolve, through the mere mechanical juxtaposition of successive layers in the manner of a human polyp. It is natural that such a community should have absorbed intact all the tendencies of the extraordinary individual, Antonio Conselheiro, whose protean appearance, that of a saint exiled on earth, that of a fetish in flesh and bone, and that of a limping bonze, was especially calculated to revive the generative stigmata of the three races. Of course, Indian, black, and white.
Yeah.
Accepting blindly all that he taught them, wholly immersed in their dreams of religion, living with the constant, sorrowing preoccupation of the life to come, they found their world within that protecting girdle of mountains and gave no thought to institutions such as might guarantee them a destiny of another sort here on earth. All this was meaningless to them. Canudos was their cosmos. So that kind of summarizes the people, the land, and of course, if you read the book, you'll see the struggle.
Yes. Yeah.
And the battle is really between two brothers that do not understand and nor they know each other, the coast and the backlands.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. I do hope you'll take your time and be patient with this text. It's long. The author takes his time with the description of the land, with the description of the people, but this is really one of the masterpieces. It's hugely appreciated by writers, by people interested in Brazil, and obviously by us as we learn about Latin America. So be patient. I really do hope that you'll appreciate this language and the translation. Anyway, it's great.
Translation is really very good. I was surprised.
Yeah,
because I started reading it in Portuguese. I said, oh, it's difficult reading in Portuguese.
Yes, right. Whereas it's fluent. One feels that it's not a translation, which is how you judge a translation from a language you can't compare to the original. So it reads beautifully in English, I think.
Yes, it does. I know we're very short on time, but if I can just take 5 minutes.
Please do.
Just 5 minutes. This is actually, it's going to nicely summarize, put it all together. There's a movie that is a sign. It's called Bye Bye Brazil. It came out in 1979 and is directed by Carlos Diegues. Carlos Diegues is a Brazilian director who was part of the Brazilian New Wave. Just like we had a French New Wave with Jean-Luc Godard, we have a Brazilian New Wave that has some very interesting movies if you're ever interested. And he had been, after the military coup of 1964, he had been exiled overseas because, of course, he was intellectual. And he spent several years abroad, and then he came back to Brazil and he started doing movies again, but less controversial, but still with a very important social critique. And the Bye Bye Brazil's main theme is how people deal with a changing country in their day-to-day lives. And at the same time, how you have this dream of a better future, because this is really what Brazil is called, the land of the future. I think now is when Brazil is finally achieving its potential, and it might be no longer the land of the future, and it's becoming the land of the present. But all my life living in Brazil, Brazil was always called the land of the future. And the immigrants came to Brazil because of the future. Bye Bye Brazil was filmed right before the opening, you know, and we go back to civilian rule in Brazil, and it shows the country still torn between a huge amount of progress but a huge amount of tradition. So we have this circus that is performing in the interior of Brazil, and they're very, very quaint. You know, they play a record, and the Salome dances the rumba and speaks in Spanish, and the audience just think it's fantastic. But of course they don't have TV. So as they move from village to village, when they arrive in a village that has television, because they see the antennas, and they call this fish bones, because that's not satellite. Where, of course, we're talking 40 years ago, where you had the old antennas that looked like
clotheslines or
fish bones on the roofs. So as soon as he sees that, he knows that the audience is not going to be good, because they have television. They no longer need to see a dancer or a hat, handkerchiefs coming out of a hat, right? And so that's what it is. It's change. It changes in the interior of Brazil, and we have also this young man who falls in love with the Salome, and he wants to leave the backlands, and he's the typical sertanejo. He plays the accordion. He has never left his village. He wants to leave. He wants to see the ocean. He wants to see the other Brazil. So he jumps on board and leaves with the circus. And where they really want to go, they want to go to Amazon, because Amazon signifies everything that is the land of the future in Brazil. So they end up in Brasilia because they don't really find anything in the Amazon that satisfies them, and Brasilia is where they get their better life. So it's almost it reinforces everything that we've talked based on the history,
right?
And so there's a very, very interesting scene where, you know, Brazil is still a developing country. We used to call underdeveloped, and then it became developing. But so there's a very interesting scene where the Lord Gypsy, which is the director of the little circus troupe, he has a show where he shows snowflakes falling in the backlands. So he is in this impoverished village with an audience of 5 people that have never seen anything, and he's got little cotton flakes or little paper flakes, white, and it's snow. And they all believe that it's really snow.
It's magical realism.
It's magical. And there's snow. And he says, Brazil has snow, just like every other civilized country in the world.
That's very
So it's you know, you'll see. So basically, they just, you know, it's a dream about this fabulous golden city of riches that is just behind the horizon. Is it the Amazon? Is it Brasilia? Is it the Brazil of tomorrow? But it's there. You know, it's that's where we're going to go. All Brazil is here to work on the road and to buy land. Pineapples are the size of watermelons, and the trees are like skyscrapers, and ores and precious stones are just lying on the ground to be picked up.
That's great. Thank you so much, Annie. Now, do notice that on our syllabus, you can watch the movie on Netflix as an instant. I've forgotten the title.
It's a streamer.
It's a streamer, and it's free. Matt, if you are not a subscriber to Netflix, then I hope you will find someone who is and ask them if they would like to watch this movie with you, because you watch it on your computer. If you have any trouble with finding someone who is a subscriber to Netflix and you happen not to be, do get in touch with me, because I very much want you to see this movie. As Annie just said, it summarizes so many things that she has talked about and that we've read about in these 2 chapters in Williamson with respect to the coastal culture, the hinterlands, the backlands, the interior, the frontier, whatever you want to call it, the inland part of Brazil, which is enormous. Check your maps one more time to make sure you got it in your mental set here, the shape of the country itself. But the movie does a nice job of tying up a number of issues that we've seen to the present in these 2 lectures. So Annie, thank you so much.
And it's very entertaining as well.
There you go. Yes, everyone loves to be assigned a movie, even me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.